In this exercise, we're going to be discussing creating shell features. Inventor considers these thin-walled parts. I think you and I would probably consider these plastic parts. Basically, anything that's going to be molded can be created from a shelled part. You can get creative and use it for other features in other situations, but for the most part, for the sake of this exercise, we'll consider them molded plastic features. So let's come up and select the shell command. I'm going to use the full toolbar just to show you guys how it works, but you can use the mini toolbar most of the time on this. I'm going to pin this over here and get it out of my way. First thing we're going to do is select the face we want to remove. So you select the red arrow there, and you get a really good preview. You can see what it looks like. If I select another face, see basically the opening for my hairdryer, and I could select OK now, and I would have a 1 millimeter thick shell all the way around this. But if I come back in here and edit it, maybe I want to do some different things here. If I expand this out, what I can do is I could say this part, and this part, instead of having a 1 millimeter shell, they need to have just a little bit more strength to them. So I'm going to say these are going to get a 1.5. I'm going to click to add, and I'm going to say this outer part here that's going to be the handle, I want to say it's going to be about a 2. Now in real life, I know they never do this because my wife goes through these things like most people go through napkins at a restaurant. I know they're very fragile. But if I was going to design a hairdryer, I would make it a little bit more substantial so that I wouldn't have to buy these things all the time. So I'm going to make the handle just a little bit beefier there. And then I also need to remove the vents here. We have the vents over here, and you'll notice it's not letting me select them one at a time. So I'm going to hit OK just so we can take our thicknesses, our multi-wall thicknesses. You can see our screws now are 1.5. Our standoffs, and then our handles at 2. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say, instead of select that, I'm going to say sketch features. I'm going to come in here and double click this again. And this time, see there, I'm going to turn off automatically chain faces. So what I'm able to do is go through here and get these air gaps one at a time so that this hairdryer can actually breathe whenever it's on. Because that's the number one thing that destroys a hairdryer. Gets full of hairspray and lint and things like that and can't breathe, and you'll find that your wife can burn one up in about 2 weeks. So now you can see through there real nice. The chain faces is what it tries to do for you. You'll notice what I did was I got out of this to kind of save it because there's not an autosave in Inventor. I know that sometimes when you do complex things like this, it will crash Inventor. Very simple command, there's not a whole lot to it. But at the same time, there is the fact that this is such a complicated calculation that this can crash easily. So what I'll do is I'll get out of it and save and get back into it before I do something that may or may not cause it to crash. It's a good habit to get into when you're dealing with shell features. I found this a lot. Something that I wouldn't think would crash it always ends up crashing it. So I make a good habit of getting out of it, saving, and getting back into the command if I'm going to do something complex. For the sake of this exercise, I didn't really have to, but I wanted to show you kind of a workflow so you understand you're not up at 2 in the morning cussing your computer because you just lost everything. Not that that's ever happened to me, but, I've heard stories. So now we can see that our hairdryer has this nice fins through it. There is one other option I can come in here and look at, is how I wanted to calculate it. Here in the beginning, I said I wanted to go from the outside in. Basically, I'm saying I modeled the outside of this hairdryer. Now, that may not be true. The majority of hairdryers, you're basing it really on two things. You've got your heating element and you've got your motor. So maybe you've modeled your heating element and your motor as small as you can get it. And so you have to have this cavity on the inside. So then in that case, what you'd do is you'd say, okay, that was the cavity, so I want it to go the inside out. And so that'll give you the inside volume exactly the way you had it, and then it'll try to go outward. And you'll notice that that kind of eats my holes there. Or I can go in both directions. And what that basically says is, hey, I've modeled the median and go in both directions. Usually, either the inside or the outside. I don't ever go both. The majority of the time, if you're doing some kind of consumer part, a mouse or hairdryer or something like that, you're going to kind of know what the outside is, not really the inside. So you're going to use this top one more times than not, but you can use the others if you do know the inside instead of the outside. And then you have the options of how do you want it to do approximation. Sometimes in some very complex areas, it's impossible to keep exactly 1 millimeter. So what you do is you tell it to kind of do a mean, or you can set a tolerance in here. We could say, instead of doing mean, never go too thin or never go too thick. And here's what the tolerance is going to be for it. Here's 10%, or you can optimize it. Most of the time, whenever I'm doing plastic stuff, it's always never go too thick. Because if you ever go too thick, then you're going to end up with dimpling and reduction in thick areas. If you're doing something really, really thin, you can go the other way where you don't want it to be so thin that it'll fall apart. You'll get a soft spot or something that'll just become wafer thin. You can kind of decide, do you want to go never too thin, never too thick? Mean, for the most part, works pretty good if you have a good clean part. The only time I ever seen this is if you get into some really tight areas where it's kind of iffy in how it calculates it. We hit OK, and we're done. It's really that simple on the shell command. There's not a whole lot to it. As always, if you want to edit it, you see I've jumped in and out of this just by double clicking on it. And I can edit most everything in here. About the only thing I can't do is go back in and turn on chain faces and then basically select the entire thing. It's going to destroy the part. And really, you could do that. So there's not a whole lot you can't do with this. Play with it. Get creative with it. I've seen some people do some very creative things with shells, even in the sheet metal industry, where they've used shell to create sheet metal. It's not recommended, but you can do very creative things with it. Or even hollow out objects that you want to create by some other means of manufacturing. Anything you're going to cast or injection mold, blow mold, things like that, you can use the shell command for, and it's a very quick and easy way to create these plastic molded parts. Have fun with it, see what you can do, and enjoy.